Hi there. This video is on quadratic word problem applications. So this is the second part of your video notes. Make sure that you fill in the notes along with us. You have a handout for this one. So a toy rocket is launched from the ground straight upward. The height of the rocket above the ground in feet is given by the equation h of t equals negative 16t squared plus 64t, where t is the time in seconds. Determine the domain for this function in the given context. Explain your reasoning. So we need to remember that domain is all a set of inputs, or x values. So possible x values for this equation. So what we want to do is we want to think, how is this going to look? So if we were just to quickly sketch this, we know a couple things about this graph. Remember, this is our x-axis, this is our t in this case, time, and here we're looking at the height, because we want to know the height of the rocket, h. And we know a couple of things already. We know that the a value is negative 16. Since it's negative, it's going to be concave down. We also know that the c value isn't there because there's no constant, so it must be 0, which means that the y-intercept is at 0. So we know it starts right here because of the y-intercept. And then we know that it's going to look something like this. And at some point, the toy rocket is going to hit the ground. And that's what this is really asking us. Because obviously the parabola would keep going, but in this context of the problem, the ground is going to stop it. So it's asking us, what is the domain right here? Or in other words, what are our roots? Now for this problem, you could factor it because they have a 16t in common, but I want to show you a different way to do this that you can always use in order to find the roots. And this is something called the quadratic formula. And just remember, you can always use it to find the roots. So let's go ahead and plug in our a, b, and c values. Remember, our c value in this case is 0. That's our a value, negative 16, our b value is 64, and our c value is 0. And let's plug it into the quadratic formula. You might remember this from last time. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's go ahead and plug in what we know. B is 64, so negative 64 plus or minus, so we'll have two answers. The square root of b squared, that's 64 squared, minus 4ac. Well, if you see here, c is 0. So whenever we multiply something by 0, the whole thing's going to become 0. So it's 4 times a, negative 16 times c, 0. But we know this whole thing's going to be equal to 0. So what we'll end up getting is going to be, this becomes 0, and the square root of 64 squared will just be 64. So we'll have two answers. We'll have negative 64 plus or minus 64 over negative 32. And we can go ahead and write those two versions. First, let's write the plus version, and then we'll write the minus version. The plus version would be negative 64 plus 64 over negative 32. And the minus version would be negative 64 minus 64 over 32. Excuse me, negative 32. So this will give us two answers. This is going to be 0 over negative 32, or just 0. And this will be negative minus a negative, that's still negative. Negative 128 over 32, negative 32. A negative divided by a negative, that's actually going to make positive 4. So our roots are 0 and positive 4. That means that the domain for this function is everything between 0 and 4. So we can write it like this, from 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 4. Remember, in this case, our x value, we're using a t for time. Or we could also write it in interval notation as everything including 0 up to everything including 4. Remember, our brackets mean that we include it. Our parentheses means that we do not include it. Let's look at problem number 4 now. A rocket carrying fireworks is launched from a hill 80 feet above the lake. The rocket will fall into the lake after exploding at its maximum height. The rocket's height above the surface of the lake is given by the function h of t equals negative 16t squared plus 64t plus 80. So what is the height of the rocket after 1.5 seconds? Remember, our seconds are being measured in terms of time, t. So what we really want to do is plug in 1.5 for our value of t. So let's go ahead and plug in 1.5 into this equation, and you should get your answer. H of t, in this case 1.5, will be equal to negative 16 times 1.5 squared plus 64 times 1.5 plus 80. Just make sure that as you simplify this, that you do the square first. Because you use your exponents before you multiply and add and subtract. I'm going to leave this one for you to finish on your own because we did one like this in class. And I'm going to focus on C. After how many seconds after it's launched will the rocket hit the lake? So problem C asks us, after how many seconds after it's launched will the rocket hit the lake? Right? So it goes up, it goes across, and then boom, it hits down. When it hits down and hits the ground, what we're really asking to do is we're being asked to find the roots. So we know it's launched from 80 feet. We know it's going down. And the question's asking us, what is that point right there? So we'll have two roots, but this negative root isn't really going to be important to our question because it's asking us, when does it hit the lake? And you can't have negative time. So we're wondering, what is our positive root? Again, in order to do that, we could factor this, or we could just straight go to the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Remember our a value, b value, and c value. So let's go ahead and plug this in. I'll go down and then I'll go across. So x is negative b, negative 64, plus or minus square root of 64 squared. I'm substituting that, so I'll write it in purple. Minus 4 times a, negative 16, times c, 80, all over 2a. Okay, so let's simplify this. Let's see, b squared, that's 64 squared, which is 4,096, minus, let's see, we've got a negative times a negative, so that'll actually make it a positive. 4 times 16 times 80. 5,120. All over 2a. So let's go ahead and add what's underneath the radical. And we get negative 64 plus or minus the square root of 9,216 all over negative 32. Now remember, we're going to get two answers. We don't care about the negative one, we only care about the positive one. So the square root of that, square root of 9216 equals 96. So we have negative 64 plus or minus 96 over negative 32. So we have two versions, our positive and our negative version. Let's simplify them both, and then let's care about our positive answer. So our positive version is negative 64 plus 96 over negative 32. And our negative version is negative 64 minus 96 over 32. Excuse me, negative 32. So let's simplify this. So if we do negative 64 plus 96 divided by negative 32, we get a 1. Excuse me, a negative 1. Now we don't care about negative 1 because that's going to be our value. Over here we don't have negative time, we want our positive value. So if we do negative 64 minus 96 divided by negative 32, we'll get positive 5. That's the value that we care about because that's our positive value. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that the rocket will hit the lake after 5 seconds. So whenever you see a word problem about something touching the ground or hitting the ground or going back to the surface, you're going to be finding the roots.